The memory is still so clear, the way the sunshine glinted off the perfectly manicured lawn of my house, the house I'd poured every ounce of my heart and savings into, the very house they deemed too happy. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened. I'm Sarah, and my life in the pristine, ridiculously organized community of Willow Creek was about to go from peaceful to a straight-up, legal drama nightmare, all thanks to a group of self-important busybodies known as the Homeowners Association or the HOA. They operate under a veneer of order and maintaining property values, but underneath, it's just pure, unadulterated power hunger. This isn't just about a brightly colored bird feeder or a slightly overgrown rose bush. This is about control, and I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go to enforce their twisted definition of normal. Before we dive into the absolute absurdity of this story, comment which country you're watching from and what's the silliest rule your own HOA or landlord ever tried to enforce. Let's see who's dealt with the most ridiculous tyranny. My house wasn't outlandish by any stretch. It was vibrant, yes, but tastefully so, I thought. I had painted my front door a cheerful, deep robin's egg blue instead of the mandated soul-crushing beige or taupe. My garden was a riot of color, petunias, hydrangeas, and sunflowers, not the austere, monochromatic landscape of clipped boxwoods favored by my neighbors. I had even installed a little whimsical stone gnome peeking out from under a rose bush, a small touch of personality in a sea of conformity. It was my little slice of sunshine, and every time I pulled into the driveway after a long shift at the hospital, the color made me genuinely smile, which apparently was a direct violation of the HOA's unspoken code of emotional neutrality. I'd been living here for 2 years without a peep of trouble, believing I was safely tucked away in my colorful little sanctuary, until the day the notorious HOA president, a woman named Beverly, darkened my doorway. I was watering my prize-winning blue hydrangeas, the ones that had just burst into magnificent bloom, when I saw her heavy polished shoes pause on the edge of my lawn. Beverly, a woman who seemed to have been born wearing a stiff, beige pencil skirt and a perpetual expression of mild disgust, was unmistakable. She carried a clipboard, of course, because an HOA official without a clipboard is like a politician without a bad promise, incomplete. The air immediately thickened with a palpable sense of officialdom and impending doom, replacing the pleasant scent of freshly tilled earth and blooming flowers with something sharp and metallic, like the edge of a bad decree. I straightened up, my heart sinking a little, the water hose suddenly feeling heavy and awkward in my hand, knowing instantly that this wasn't a social call. "Ms. Davis," she began, her voice a low, grating monotone that sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together, "we have received multiple complaints." She didn't specify who, which was their usual tactic. The collective is always the accuser, never an individual neighbor who might have to face you at the community mailbox. I braced myself, wiping my damp hands on my gardening jeans, fully expecting a lecture about the gnome or perhaps a demand to trim a particularly enthusiastic vine. But the actual complaint, when it came, was so staggeringly absurd that I almost laughed in her face, an impulse I quickly suppressed, knowing that laughter would only fuel her righteous indignation. She tapped the paper on her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail, the sound like a tiny gavel hitting a desk, and read out the exact words, her lips barely moving. "The overall aesthetic of 142 Willow Way is deemed overly stimulating, verging on emotional exhibitionism, and creating an environment that is distractingly cheerful to the detriment of community cohesion." I blinked, trying to process the corporate speak for "your house is too damn happy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was I being fined because my house was smiling too much? I remember the smell of her perfume, expensive, sharp, and overwhelmingly floral, almost aggressively so, contrasting sharply with the simple, earthy smell of the dirt I loved to work with. "Beverly, are you seriously telling me that my house is too happy?" I asked, struggling to keep the disbelief and rising anger out of my voice. I took a deep breath, trying to remember the breathing techniques I used on my most stressed-out patients, reminding myself that yelling at the HOA president would only end in a swift, punitive fine. She didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the absurdity of the statement, which was perhaps the most unsettling part of the whole exchange. It was clear she completely believed the bureaucratic nonsense she was spouting, or at least was committed to acting like she did. "It is a violation of the spirit of Article 4, Section B, Subsection 7 of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, which mandates a general adherence to the harmonious and tranquil visual standards of the community," she droned on, pulling the usual HOA trick of citing a vague, meaningless section of their enormous rule book that no one but she had ever actually read. She then presented me with an official-looking notice, a heavy piece of cream-colored cardstock with the HOA crest embossed in gold, a document that felt needlessly weighty, like a miniature death sentence for my beloved blue door. The notice demanded that I immediately repaint the door to an approved earth tone and drastically reduce the visual clutter of my garden within 7 days, or face a significant daily fine that would quickly bankrupt me. The shock quickly turned to a slow, burning rage. This wasn't just a rule, it was a personal attack on my right to express myself on my own property, an attempt to stifle joy and enforce a chilling uniformity. As she turned her back and started walking away, her heels clicking precisely on the asphalt, the official notice still clutched in my hand, I knew I wouldn't comply. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sudden powerful realization that this wasn't just a simple disagreement over curb appeal. This was a battle for autonomy, and I wasn't going to let them win by sheer intimidation. That evening I walked through my garden, touching the petals of my cheerful flowers, my mind racing. I knew I needed to fight back, but Beverly was notoriously untouchable, always protected by the opaque bureaucracy of the board. The only way to beat them, I realized, was to expose them, to find out what really went on behind those closed, mahogany doors in their private meetings, and that was when the idea, the slightly illegal but absolutely necessary idea, hit me with the force of a train. I needed to see what they were hiding. The idea felt like a knot of lead in my stomach, risky, potentially illegal, but utterly unavoidable if I was going to save my house and, frankly, my sanity. I couldn't just repaint the door. Giving in to that demand would be surrendering the entire battlefield. This was about principle, about pushing back against the petty tyranny that was slowly suffocating the life out of our neighborhood. The HOA board meetings were held every second Tuesday in the community center's small, windowless conference room, a place I imagined was specifically designed to drain the spirit and encourage draconian decision-making. These meetings were always closed door, meaning only the 5 board members were allowed inside, a policy they justified as necessary for confidential discussion of financial and legal matters. This secrecy was their armor, allowing them to make arbitrary decisions like calling my house emotionally exhibitionist, without any accountability to the residents who paid their salaries. I had a secret weapon though, a small, highly sensitive camera no bigger than a quarter that I occasionally used for surveillance in a high-security section of the hospital where I worked, a tiny piece of technological brilliance designed to be virtually undetectable. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The plan was audacious, and the thought of getting caught, trespassing, potential wiretapping charges, and the ensuing financial ruin made my palms sweat. But the thought of Beverly's smug face and the beige tyranny she represented was a powerful counterweight to my fear. I spent the next 4 days meticulously scouting the community center, timing the cleaning crew and knotting the lock's mechanism. The lock on the conference room door, to my surprise, was cheap and standard, not the high-security system their confidential discussions seemed to warrant. The night before the meeting, I put on dark clothes, tied my hair back tightly, and waited until the neighborhood was completely dark and quiet, listening to the deep silence punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. I moved quickly, slipping into the community center's unused side entrance, the one the cleaning crew always left ajar for their late-night exit, the air inside smelling faintly of old coffee and industrial-strength floor wax. The conference room was at the end of a long, fluorescent-lit hallway, and as I approached I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a loud, erratic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I worked quickly and quietly, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The lock gave way with a soft, almost polite click and I slipped inside. The room was exactly as I had pictured, a large, polished mahogany table surrounded by 5 high-backed leather chairs. It reeked of stale ambition and dust. I located the perfect spot behind a heavy velvet curtain where a power outlet was conveniently located for the camera's long-term power source. I affixed the tiny camera with a strong adhesive, positioning it to capture the entire table and, crucially, the faces of the board members. The setup took less than 5 minutes. The camera was so small it was functionally invisible, a black speck against the dark fabric. Before I left, I paused, looking at the empty seats, imagining the conversation that would take place there tomorrow, a conversation that held the fate of my blue door and my personal peace. A strange, cold certainty settled over me. I was about to expose a truth much darker than an overzealous HOA rule. The next evening I sat in my living room, the blinds drawn, my laptop screen a single glowing rectangle in the dark. The meeting was set to start at 7:00 p.m. The streaming feed from the tiny camera was flawless, a clear wide-angle shot of the mahogany table, already littered with stacks of papers and half-filled water glasses. I watched as the 5 board members filed in, their faces tired but etched with that familiar, self-important air. There was Beverly, of course, taking the head chair, her stiff posture radiating authority. Mr. Thompson, the treasurer, a nervous, perpetually sweating man in an ill-fitting suit. Mrs. Albright, the secretary, whose eyes missed nothing. and two others, Mr. Chen and Ms. Perez, who mostly served as Beverly's reliable voting bloc. They settled in, the leather chairs groaning under their weight, and Beverly immediately slapped a file down on the table, the sound echoing loudly in the silent room. "All right, let's begin," Beverly announced, her voice clipped and efficient. "First order of business, the Davis property at 142 Willow Way, the Happy House." She said the nickname with such utter contempt that it made me clench my fists. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat nervously. "Beverly, I'm not sure we have the legal standing for this level of aesthetic control. I mean, the color isn't in the list of prohibited shades and the fines are." Beverly cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand, the sound of her heavy gold bracelet clanking against the table a sharp metallic interruption. "The standing is that we say it is. The rest of the neighborhood follows the rules. We cannot allow this blatant disregard for our authority, or we'll have a neighborhood full of gnomes and day-glow doors." It was pure intimidation, a simple power play disguised as community standards. Then the conversation took a sharp, unexpected turn. Mrs. Albright leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the camera's sensitive microphone nevertheless picked up perfectly. "Forget the gnome, Beverly. Did you get the documents from the county assessor on the Davis property?" Beverly smirked, a cold, thin expression that sent a shiver down my spine. "Of course." Thompson read the valuation update. The nervous treasurer pulled a sheet from the pile, his hands shaking slightly, and began to read, his voice surprisingly clear as he recited the numbers. "The 142 Willow Way property, due to its unique aesthetic and clear pride of ownership, has appreciated 18% in the last 2 years, well above the neighborhood average of 6%. It's currently the highest non-board member valuation on the street." I was stunned. They weren't fining me because my house was too happy. They were fining me because my successful property value was making theirs look bad by comparison, shattering their collective illusion of superiority. But that wasn't the core reason, not yet. Beverly leaned forward, her eyes glittering with cold malice, and pointed a finger at the center of the table. "Exactly, she's messing with the balance." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. "Now, Thompson, the real reason we're doing this, the other documents." The treasurer turned a sickening shade of pale, and he looked pleadingly at Beverly, who simply stared him down until he finally, reluctantly, reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, the kind used for legal correspondence. The contents of that envelope, when they were finally revealed, were about to detonate the carefully constructed facade of the entire Willow Creek HOA, and I watched, my heart pounding a terrifying rhythm as he opened it, revealing the true, sinister reason behind their assault on my blue door. The treasurer, Mr. Thompson, looked utterly miserable, his brow beaded with sweat under the glare of the conference room light. He held the manila envelope as if it contained a venomous snake, his eyes darting to Beverly, who was watching him with an expression of cold, unrelenting expectation. The silence in the feed was excruciatingly long, broken only by the soft, almost imperceptible whir of my laptop fan. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like the last gasp of a drowning man, he pulled out a folded sheaf of blueprints and a site plan, spreading them out on the table. These are the plans for the new Community Amenities Center," Thompson stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, though the microphone picked up every strained syllable. "The location, as you all know, was originally slated for the old green space on the corner of Elm and Oak." He pointed a shaky finger at a section of the map far from my street, the originally designated location. "However, our revised site plan, which has not yet been approved or disclosed to the residents, places the new center, specifically the new, oversized parking garage, directly behind 142 Willow Way." A wave of nausea hit me, so sharp and sudden that I had to grip the edge of my desk. The new amenities center wasn't the problem. It was the massive, multi-story concrete parking structure that would replace my back-facing property line, my beautiful sunny garden with a perpetually shaded wall of gray concrete and the constant noise of traffic. My property value, which had been celebrated moments ago, would plummet overnight. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just attacking my door. They were intentionally depreciating my property to make way for a lucrative, undisclosed construction project that would have otherwise sparked a massive community uprising. Mrs. Albright leaned forward, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "And that, Thompson, is why the Happy House needs to be shut down. If Davis realizes her property is about to be systematically devalued by 50% overnight, she'll fight the rezoning and the construction with a legal team. She has the money. She's too invested, too happy with that place. We need her out, or at least terrified into submission, so that when the construction notice finally goes out, she's already packed and gone, or too financially crippled by fines to fight us." The entire meeting was a calculated, insidious plot to bully me into moving or selling at a depressed price, all to fast-track their shady, secret development deal. My colorful door wasn't the offense, my resistance was. The ensuing discussion was chilling. They outlined their strategy in clinical detail, relentlessly escalate the fines, send inspectors, who I now realized were just disguised threats, and use the vague language of the HOA covenants to manufacture an impossible situation where the only escape was to sell the house at a loss to an HOA-friendly developer, a developer who, Thompson let slip, was actually the nephew of Beverly's husband. It wasn't just petty tyranny, it was outright financial conspiracy involving conflict of interest and potentially illegal zoning manipulation. My anger had cooled into a hard, steely resolve. I had all the evidence I needed. The moment the meeting ended and the screen went black, I disconnected the recording, my hands shaking not from fear but from righteous fury. I had hours of audio and video proving intentional malice, conspiracy to commit financial harm, and gross abuse of power. I immediately reached out to a lawyer friend who specialized in property law, sending him the full, unedited recording with a single, furious email. They didn't like my blue door. They wanted my land. The next morning, I did not repaint my door. Instead, I drove to the local news station's investigative desk, a copy of the video on a flash drive and another copy in an encrypted file on my phone. The following Tuesday, the day of the HOA's scheduled final inspection and the imposition of a crippling fine, Beverly and the entire board arrived at my house in their usual intimidating formation. But this time they weren't met by a meek homeowner. They were met by a line of 3 news vans from every major local network, their tall antennas raised to the sky like metallic spears. My front lawn was completely full of neighbors, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock, all drawn out by the unprecedented commotion and the promise of drama. Beverly stopped dead on my sidewalk, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray as she recognized the reporters, the cameras, and the blinding flashbulbs. Before she could say a single word, my lawyer stepped forward, holding up a copy of the injunction we had filed with the county. "Good morning, Ms. Albright, Mr. Thompson et al.," he stated, his voice booming over the chaos. "This injunction immediately halts all HOA activity concerning Ms. Davis's property, specifically all fines, until a full investigation into the matter of financial conspiracy and misuse of board authority can be completed. We have conclusive video evidence of the board's plot to devalue this property for the purpose of an undisclosed, self-dealing development project." He then held up the tiny camera I'd retrieved, which was attached to a large, clear display board. "This small device recorded your entire last meeting, revealing your plan to financially ruin Ms. Davis and illegally rezone for a parking garage on her property line. Your term is over, effective immediately. And the county assessor is already reviewing your financial records." The crowd of neighbors gasped, their shock now turning into a roar of furious, disgusted whispers. Beverly tried to push past the reporters, her composure finally shattered, but the cameras followed her every desperate movement. Within a week, Beverly and the rest of the board had resigned under threat of criminal charges and a massive civil suit from not just me, but a growing number of residents who had also been subjected to their intimidation. The development project was immediately canceled and the original green space was protected. I never repainted my robin's egg blue door. In fact, several of my neighbors, inspired by the fall of the HOA tyrants, repainted their doors in cheerful, non-compliant colors, one bright orange, one vibrant teal. I never heard from Beverly again, and the last I saw of Mr. Thompson was a quick, relieved wave from the back of a moving van. My house was finally allowed to be happy, not just visually, but truly, in a community that had reclaimed its freedom from a few petty, corrupt individuals. The moral of the story is simple: authority, when left unchecked, becomes tyranny. Never let someone else's insecurity dictate your joy, especially when their rules are just a mask for their own corruption. If something feels wrong, trust your gut and don't be afraid to put a camera where it needs to be. Like, share, and subscribe if you think the world needs fewer tyrannical HOAs and more blue doors.